It's March here at Monticello, and the natural world is starting to wake up. Bloodroot, Lenten rose, hyacinths, peach, and pear trees are all in bloom. As Jefferson put it, spring makes a paradise of our country. It's also Women's History Month, and today we're going to talk about two of Jefferson's granddaughters who helped him in the garden. This is A Rich Spot of Earth, a podcast about gardening and the natural world. I'm Michael Tricomi, manager and curator of historic gardens at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home in Albemarle County, Virginia. When Jefferson was preparing to retire from the presidency in 1809, he was looking forward to two activities in particular: gardening and spending time with his family. As luck would have it, the two were intertwined. Jefferson's 11 grandchildren spent much of their time at Monticello, and two of his granddaughters, Anne Carey Randolph and Ellen Wales Randolph, shared his love of flowers. Curator of plants Peggy Cornett sat down with me and flower gardener Debbie Donley to talk about gardening and family.
Anne Carey Randolph was writing Jefferson quite often during the summer of 1807 when he was sending letters and diagrams of how he wanted the gardens to look when he retired. He wrote from Washington that I find that the limited number of our flower beds will too much restrain the variety of flowers in which we might want to indulge, because to that point they only had 20 oval flower beds laid out. And so his idea was to expand his garden by incorporating the entire west lawn with a winding walk. And on the back of this letter that he sent to her, he actually sketched it. And it's one of our most important historical documents from Jefferson's own hand.
Jefferson explained that the new design will, quote, give us abundant room for a great variety of flowers. Anne Carey Randolph also updated Jefferson about what was blooming.
He would write her letters from Washington, and then she would respond, often writing letters from Edge Hill, which is where her family home was located, which is near Monticello. And often the state of the flower gardens were reported to her by Monticello's enslaved domestic butler, Burwell Colbert. She said, the flowers are all coming up very well, particularly the tulips, of which Burwell Colbert counted at least 40 flourishing ones. So she relied on Colbert to give her these updates, as well as reports from Wormley Hughes, who was the enslaved gardener at Monticello. He wrote in 1808, "My dearest Anne, I shall not attempt to get any more flower, roots, and seeds from Philadelphia this season, and must rely entirely on you to preserve those we have by having them planted in the proper time. And Mr. Bacon was the overseer, will make Wormley Hughes prepare the beds whenever you let him know, so that they may be ready when you go over from Edge Hill to set out the roots." So he really relied upon her. But then in September of 1808, he began to lose this cherished relationship because she was the eldest grandchild and she married to Charles Lewis Bankhead. And in November of that year of 1808, Anne wrote to her grandfather with assurances that the flowers at Monticello would be taken care of by Ellen. She said, "On coming from Edge Hill, I left all the flowers on Ellen's care. However, I shall be with you early enough in March to assist about the border, which, if you mean to plant them there with the wild and bulbous roots, once we have already completely filled the borders." So it was a real family relationship, and it was, I think, Jefferson's vision for his retirement garden was his ability to spend time with his family and to enjoy the flowers, especially.
I love that letter from Jefferson to Anne Carey Randolph, where we get the vision for the winding walk. It's a defining feature of Monticello's landscape. Its meandering curves reflect a trend Jefferson had admired in England. Designers were moving away from rigid, formal gardens, instead creating landscapes that felt more natural.
I was just at a talk yesterday about the Japanese garden and how it intentionally meanders instead of going straight, because you have to look down and see where you're going, and it forces you to take it all in as you're going.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so when you're going around the winding walk, it's the same feeling, because you've got to watch where you're going because it's going to curve.
One of the things that I like about the winding walk is how it's totally surrounded by trees.
Right.
And it's this little, this serene garden within the grove and the trees and the woods around Monticello.
encloses it a bit.
Yeah, it gives it that enclosed feeling, and it really creates a special garden space. And just the seasonality of the garden, having things blooming at different times. There's always something to enjoy there.
Later, Jefferson talked about dividing the winding walk into 10-foot beds or compartments so that he could organize the garden more efficiently. Debbie still uses the same numbering system. The beds that are on the inside of the winding walk are the I beds, and the ones that are on the outside of the winding walk are the O beds.
Inner and outer.
And outer. And then there's north and south, so there's N and S, and then you count the number of beds. That was Jefferson's scheme. It was really ingenious.
You can
Very
tell
efficient.
exactly which bed you mean. You can direct somebody to that specific space.
And Debbie makes out her plans for planting the flowers every year, and she'll send a note out with the gardeners and number it out for them. They can just go down and count it out.
I also like the way he's divided them up into 10-foot sections, because for the most part we put one species of plant in there like he had done, and you just get a real feel for what that plant looks like as opposed to a mixed border. Right. And so you really get to see it in all of its glory.
Yeah, he was getting seeds from different people, and I think he really did want to observe by having it in a compartment, basically.
Like a laboratory.
Exactly. And then that winding, like you're saying, it's very contemplative, and it causes your vision to change. You're going from one direction to another as you curve, and so you have different prospects in front of you. Sometimes you're looking out toward the mountains, and other times you're looking toward the south, and so it does slow you down, and it's a strolling garden, I think. Yeah.
I like to picture Jefferson and Madison walking.
And the grandchildren. There's a painting that we all referenced, the Jane Braddock Petticolas painting, and it was from 1825. And you see the family in the garden. In fact, they had races.
Right, relay races.
At Christmas, I think, when Jefferson would drop the handkerchief and the grandchildren would run around the winding walk.
And they do that today with the guides. When children are visiting school groups, they do relay races where they'll drop a handkerchief, and that's their signal to take off. I particularly like the idea of the family. I know in my family, I'm a gardener, my mother was a gardener, my grandfather was a gardener, and my son gardens. I feel like in many families, it's a time together, it's the companionship, it's the learning. It's just a good feeling to be out in a garden. That's something Jefferson obviously enjoyed with his family.
It could be just enjoying the gardens, but also working in the gardens and planting or weeding or doing anything like that, working alongside other people. It is a bonding experience.
Right. And you're teaching the little ones, that's not a weed, that's a flower.
Next, we wanted to talk about a fragrant bulb that's blooming right now, hyacinth. Jefferson ordered rare, delicate double hyacinths. They can be hard to find even today.
He did have an entire oval bed of hyacinths in various colors, red, yellow, white, and blue. And they were double. They're expensive and they're hard to obtain. The more petals, the more fragrance. So the double ones would be more fragrant than the single flowers.
We put in the Roman hyacinths, which we think is what he had. They're very long flowering. They start mid-February and they continue on until April.
The hyacinths will precede the tulips in the garden.
And they've become my favorite kind of hyacinth. They're
a dwarf form or a wild form of the big blousy hyacinths that people grow, those big double ones.
But they're still quite tall, and they do spread around a lot. Every year they'll send out another stem, and so what may start out as 2 or 3 hyacinths will end up being
I think
quite
they divide,
a bit more.
yeah.
And they just keep coming back every year.
Pink ones and white ones and
the pink ones are very faint pink.
Yeah.
You'd think they're white until you look at the white one beside it. We have that triangle bed right under Jefferson's bedroom suite, the windows there, and the granddaughters had referenced that it was a nest of sweets wafting through the windows. So I do try to always have a sweet scented plant in there, one of which is the double hyacinth. It's a purple.
Hyacinths are beautiful, but a word of warning. Wear gloves when you handle the bulbs. you can get a mild allergic reaction touching their papery skin. Now let's hear from a recent Monticello visitor.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I have really enjoyed the views from Monticello. They are beautiful.
In addition to the winding flower walk, Jefferson's garden design called for clumps of trees, but we don't know exactly what he had in mind.
When he traveled to England in the 1780s, he made notes about clumps of trees, but he wasn't real specific. But in one of the same sketches that he sent for the oval flower beds, he wanted to have clumps of trees and shrubs in very close proximity to one another in the angles of the house or the corners of the house. We've never really been able to document exactly where some of these trees and shrubs were planted, but it would be quite a different look, I think, if we were able to create a clump in those spaces. It included common trees like the tulip poplar and chokecherry and redbud, but also copper beech.
It seems like his planting scheme had an interesting mix of both native and exotic European species for the time. Beeches are a very popular tree. You go to old English manor houses and massive beeches, so certainly that's something Jefferson would have seen on his European travels was very old beech trees in the landscapes there. Another interesting one on his list of trees is Sorbus acuparia, which is the European mountain ash. It's a bit of a misnomer because it's not a true ash. It's actually in the rose family, and it's not really a species that does well in Virginia, even though there is a native mountain ash, Sorbus americana.
And it makes an interesting fruit, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's a very beautiful tree, and it's the one tree I wish I could grow at my house, but I just don't have the elevation for it.
As Robert mentioned, the Virginia climate is too warm for the European mountain ash. The American mountain ash is native to the eastern U.S., but in the south, it grows at higher elevations where it's cooler. It's about 15 to 20 feet tall and has a profusion of small white flowers in spring, followed by bright orange-red berries in late summer. Peggy and Robert also mentioned the European copper beech. These trees grow 60 to 80 feet tall. In spring, their leaves unfurl a tender copper-green color and gradually turn deep purple bronze. Jefferson called it the purple beech. In 1897, Wormley Hughes, an enslaved gardener at Monticello, planted copper beeches in the southwest and northwest angles of the house.
Jefferson was definitely interested in experimenting with these trees in a very peculiar way with these clump patterns. You look at this at first glance and you think those trees are just planted way too close together. But it was the deliberate intention to create a tight clump that Jefferson probably saw in English gardens on his travels in Europe.
But it's like the way trees in a forest or in nature where they're growing close to each other and they may lean a certain way for the light and that sort of thing. If you walk into the woods, you'll see seedlings coming up and big mature trees, and they're all near each other and they duke it out in some ways. And I think some plants like to grow with their roots in growing together. There's some benefit to that.
Right, yeah, root grafting is a real phenomenon among species.
And if you have things like redbud, which is a nitrogen-fixing tree, and then you have other trees that would benefit from that.
I think certain species could definitely be clumped better than others.
Yeah. And so I think it's an interesting concept, but it's not one that really goes over well today. People want to plant trees out on their own, like a beautiful white oak all by itself is just magnificent.
A specimen tree.
A specimen tree, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, certainly some species you can get away with it more than others. I wouldn't clump oaks together, for instance, but some of the smaller species that he may have used or trees that are just more inclined to be more columnar in their habit could certainly work better for a clump planting scheme if anyone wanted to experiment. But I wouldn't recommend a beech or an oak. They should stand alone on their own, I think. It's an aesthetic choice, basically. They did a lot of funky things with plants in the 18th century. Clumps is just one example. But just in terms of using, large tree species in such close proximity together, when you have a planting scheme like that, inevitably you're going to have very strict pruning requirements to keep them healthy. So close together, they're going to shade each other out. These were not Jefferson's primary concerns. He wanted the aesthetic feature of a clump in the landscape.
I think it can create an instant forest. Jefferson at one point said he lamented that his house wasn't embowered with shade. And I think if you have all these trees close together, they create an interesting landscape feature that can grow up and create shade, and it would be more of like a woodland environment. Especially because another plant they wanted was the
Prickly ash.
Robinia hispida, the moss locust, which is a spreading, suckering shrub, which would it be like a ground cover almost, with beautiful flowers. They're a vivid rose color.
I saw it as a transition from natural lands to more of a defined garden space.
Right.
Having these clumps of trees, you're going from forest to clumps of trees to garden. And he used similar patterns in the grove. He described clumps of shrubs or thicket in the grove as well. And so it could be trees, it could be shrubs, just planted relatively close together. And I don't think that there was any real true system. I think it was very experimental for that time. It seemed that a lot of contemporaries practiced planting in clumps in different ways. And then the shapes of them, whether they were totally circular or they were
Spiral apparently was what was informing the poplar forest clump planting.
Peggy's referring to Jefferson's second home, Poplar Forest, located about 70 miles from Monticello in Lynchburg, Virginia. Archaeologists there found evidence of tree clumps.
The archaeologists actually were able to find the root stains of the trees and shrubs. And so when they drew it out, it was a very unusual spiral shape, which Jefferson was very intrigued by spirals. If you had a drone over
an
time,
aerial
it would
view,
be...
it would look like a snail shell.
Yeah, exactly.
The clump itself is in the arrangement of a spiral, and so the trees are put at points that increase in frequency as you get closer to the center of the spiral.
Maybe 8 to 10 trees in each one. They were different.
Yeah.
We haven't really been able to determine exactly how it might have looked.
I think, too, when you think about the fact that the mountaintop was leveled off, which means taking down all the trees. So the forest is not right next to the house like it originally would have been. This is a way of bringing trees back and making these clumps. It's like an instant, little miniature forest.
There's also documentation that he had trees lining the terraces. And so again, I think it was an attempt to bring shade to the house.
Finally, we wanted to mention that guided tours of the garden start in late March. We've also got some upcoming special events.
On April 27th, from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., we will have our first annual spring open house. We'll have a second one in May, and we open our doors to the public. And we specialize in native perennials, herbs, trees, and shrubs. And this year, I've been told that we'll have some Jefferson documented annuals will be on offer that we haven't done in the
start
past.
doing that more often now, And this is all at Tufton Farm, which is the nursery.
As well as a few heirloom vegetables will be added to what's for sale.
Not only do you open your doors, you open your garden gate.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we're not just a production nursery, but we're also a display garden.
The wildflower walks, we'll have 4 this year, and the first was March 30th, and the others are April 4th, April 18th, and April 20th. They fill up quickly, and it's a way to see the wild Monticello. We walk from the visitor center down to through the forest, along all the way down to the Rivanna River. And it's a nice time to see the spring ephemerals.
They are wonderful. I look forward to it every year.
Yeah.
And for anyone interested, they offer a rare glimpse of Monticello that otherwise visitors wouldn't be able to see.
Aren't trails that are open to the public. So it has to be a guided tour with staff who know the way and know all the plants, because you're going to see a whole progression of spring ephemerals, beginning from bloodroot to bluebells and mayapple and
orchids right in the middle of the roadway.
Yeah, showy orchid and the spice bush in the woods.
Crested iris.
Dwarf crested iris. Oh, it's a delight.
If you're interested in the wildflower walk, a video on our website offers a preview. Thanks for listening to A Rich Spot of Earth. Join us next month to hear about the nurseries at Monticello and other spring topics.